Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm returning to a subject I've touched on previously, purpose. It's a word that is often used by companies to describe their raison d'etre, or reason to exist. But what does it mean in practice and why does it matter? That's what I'm going to explore with my guest, John Rosling. John is the CEO of Contexis, a company that helps organisations, particularly large ones, to find their purpose. In practice, this means bridging the gap between the stated purpose, i.e. what senior management says, and the realities on the ground. Very often, that gap can be massive. If you've ever worked in a larger organisation, it's highly likely you'll know what I mean. The reason I'm interested in purpose and bridging this gap is that a lot of human risk comes out of it. If we don't get it right, far from getting the best out of people, we can inadvertently get the worst out of them. So please enjoy this discussion with John Rosling, all about purpose. John, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Look, and I know who you are, but my listeners might not. So I wonder if we could start off by you just give us a little bit of pen portrait of who you are and what you do.
Yes, my name's John Rosling. I'm the CEO of a company called Contexis. What we do around the world, mainly the UK and Australia, is to help large organizations become more effective and productive. But what we're really interested in, our real passion, is around purpose in business and measuring purpose in partnership with some universities to really understand how organizational purpose drives human productivity, human happiness, and organizational effectiveness. That is our interest.
And what do we mean by purpose? Because obviously it's a very simple term, but there's quite a lot behind that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question because it is open to a lot of interpretation. To me, I think we're talking about the reason the organization exists. There is an implication in the term that it exists for some kind of social benefit. So I think a purpose, if it's going to be effective, is probably beyond the narrow interests of the shareholders. And I think what a purpose does is both engage humanity and clarify decision making. So it is the fundamental reason that sits at the heart of the DNA that drives everything in the organization. And the reason it's become so relevant is because a lot of larger organizations have lost their consciousness around why they really exist. As distinct from some of the more productive entrepreneurial companies that just have it so clearly in their mind. That is the distinction and difference between the two.
And it's fascinating because if you go back a few years, you sort of, what are we here to? Well, we're here to make money for shareholders. Shareholder value was the phrase that was often used. And of course, that forgets the fact that when one thinks about setting up companies, that is society giving you the right to undertake your activity. So you get many industries, there's a license, but you set up a structure that has legal benefits to you, and you undertake a particular activity. The society allows you to do that. You're permitted under law to undertake a business within the constraints of law. And so there's a flip side to that, which is the kind of, well, why are we letting you do this? And the answer clearly historically was very obvious. It was you're doing something because you're meeting a need. So go back to medieval times, it was fairly obvious what people were there to do and how that helped. And if you weren't helping, society wouldn't let you continue because people wouldn't do business with you. If it was felt you were ripping customers off or you were and then because of my and diversification and global, we've shifted away from that piece. And I think it's fascinating that when you talk about purpose, we're sort of returning to what my parents would talk about as traditional values, going back to sort of what are you here to do? How are you serving the community as much as your in other words, other stakeholders than just the shareholders?
I think we have to unpick really at least two issues. One is a sort of moral conversation, which is the one you've opened up. And the other is a sort of practical conversation about what actually makes for a great business. So from a moral perspective, you're quite right. There are principles and values in business. If you go back to medieval, I can go back a lot further than that to the root of the word company, which is about actually who you break bread with. This idea that this is an association, a companionship of human beings. And I think companies have come so far from that understanding, they would find that concept absurd. But that is the root of the word. And then there are all sorts of charters and ways that original organizations were enshrined. and mutuality and a lot of complicated things. So I think, yes, there is a conversation to be had about the moral position, the values-led position that companies should be taking, and the fact that society gifts them privileges which they need to take seriously and exercise. So there is all that conversation. The problem with focusing on that debate is that is very, very hard for a lot of organizations to actually exercise. That becomes a very sort of theoretical and abstract conversation when you're stuck in a regulated environment with shareholders, with a finance director who's telling you what to do, with a certain amount of pressure from competitors. It's all very well to have that kind of abstract conversation. And it is, I'm not in any sense underplaying it. It is highly valuable. But I think what's really interesting about the purpose debate, loathsome word though it is that what we are finding, and as I say, one of our great interests is measuring all this stuff, is actually organizations that are clear about why they exist and where that clarity, where that existence serves some benefit to society beyond shareholders, they just work better. They're just more productive, more effective. And what fascinates us, and has really been my journey for the last 25 years, is understanding what is this peculiar alchemy in an organization that creates the most effective, productive organizations on the planet. What is it that they do? And at its heart, there is this sense of why they exist. And you can call that purpose if you like. That's the word we are all using. But it's something which is really fundamental. And as I said earlier, I think entrepreneurial companies sort of get it. And I think large legacy driven, complex, bigger organizations find it very, very hard because they've become so complicated. So yes, there is a moral argument about having a sense of purposefulness, if that's not too much of a ghastly word, but that sense of, we exist, we have a duty to society and the planet that can be held as a complete principle, and that's quite right. But actually, there's a practical side to this. They're just better companies.
And let's sort of dive into the data piece, because you've nicely identified what purpose is. But how does one even think about measuring this, and how do you go about identifying, where do you get the data from, and how do you analyze it?
So, Christian, this is going to be could be a long explanation. So it's a bit of a journey, as I said. My interest from this comes from just a long history of observing organizations. I started at Unilever and saw what a great organization could be. But even there, in what I still consider to be a fine organization, I, as a person, as a human being, felt undervalued, trapped, lacking in freedom, lacking in agency and the ability to make my own decisions. And although it was a great organization in so many ways, I actually didn't really thoroughly enjoy it. I then moved from that to very large organizations which were much worse culturally, and began to try and understand the differences between them. I set up a number of my own businesses and started to explore what great organizational cultures could be, and started to observe and study other great companies. Looking at companies that really get this right, they tend to be founder-led, entrepreneurial, but they're by no means exclusively that. And if you want an example, we could go Patagonia or Netflix or, some of these organizations that have a sense of why they exist. And I became very interested in what it was in these organizations that allowed them to simultaneously be great places to work, pressurized and in some ways, hardworking, not some kind of holiday camp, but great places to work, productive, effective, fast growth, innovative, creative organizations, and also organizations that were not hell-bent on destroying the environment and society. It was that sort of combination of factors really interested me. So I thought, I did a bit of lecturing at universities on this and wrote a couple of books on it, and I sort of tried to codify what it was I thought was at the heart of great organizations, human-led, human-focused, but commercially productive organizations that were not of risk to society. And in codifying that, we came up with a view of what was driving these organizations, an operational model, if you like, an observational model of what a great business looks like. And what sits at its heart is this idea of purpose, this sense that the company knows why it exists and that reason to exist is greater than shareholder value, that it does perform something. And the reason that matters is because it's clarifying to the human people, the humanity who works there, and it's engaging to people who might buy its product. But it also clarifies leadership, and leadership finds it really easy to make decisions and create innovation and be adaptable because they're clear why, whereas most large organizations get bogged down in what and how. So we now have a sort of observational model, and I haven't even answered your question, which is
this is great stuff, though, so just keep going.
So we now kind of know what a great organization looks like. And you could write that down, and anybody who works in a company could kind of write down what a great company looks like. You know, you've got people who are engaged, who are aligned to some kind of mission. You've got cultures which are open, creative, innovative, but also compassionate. You've got leadership that's clear and adaptable and makes decisions quickly. So there's a sort of set of behaviors, if you like, that great companies have. Now, the great thing is all of those can be measured. So if you go and talk to enough academics, behavioral scientists at leading institutions around the world, you will find people who've measured every aspect of organizational performance. And so you can come up with a measure for organizational performance, which is what we've done. So we've essentially brought together all the best thinking in the world in what makes a great business. The key question then is, well, what's creating that greatness? And we believe that purpose plays a large part in that. So we now need to measure purpose. So we have an academic scale that measures purpose. So we now understand a great output, and we understand purpose. And the obvious conclusion is that you can link the two. But the reality is that there are mediating factors, cultural factors in organizations. There is a gap, in other words, between purpose and how people behave. And therefore, what we need to do as a third set of measurement is to measure the cultural factors that in our observational model we see either accelerate or decelerate purpose. So purpose creates engagement, as an example, but only within the presence of certain cultural factors. So you have to measure all that. Now, it sounds incredibly complicated, but what it creates as an output is actually quite simple, because what it creates is a measure of purpose efficacy, if you like, purpose effectiveness. So it doesn't really matter from the user's point of view how the thing works, but what it's doing is it's telling people whether purpose is working and how it's working in any organization at a level of detail. So it's explaining the causality, if we can get that far, of purpose itself, which is great for an organization, because what it tells me is not only whether I've got a good purpose or not, but how it's working, and most importantly, where it's blocked. And we've done that now in 26 countries, in organizations of all sizes, and we have a pretty clear idea now of how purpose works. And we've produced some pretty effective insight for large organizations, which have really helped them make their purpose work. And the outputs, the effect on organizations and on human happiness has been pretty amazing.
And it's interesting you talk, because I was sort of sat there thinking there's two ways of looking at this. There's way one which is sort of the purpose is, let's assume, purpose determined in boardroom stroke from legacy. And what we're doing is we're comparing that, the thing that is written on the wall or chiseled into the wall or in the company, with what's going on the ground. And so there's an interesting question that sort of says here, actually, is it in some cases that you don't have what's going on the ground doesn't match the purpose? Or is it that the purpose is wrong and what's going on the ground? When you look at those two particular things, is it more often that the purpose is okay, but it's not being acted on the ground? Or is it actually that when that purpose hits reality, the behaviors on the ground mean that maybe the purpose needs to be recalibrated? Which way round does that work?
Well, I mean, it can be both, but generally speaking, it's a form. I mean, generally speaking, most companies are intelligent enough to be able to formulate a purpose that is meaningful. You know, most companies have good advice, and they're led by intelligent people. Generally speaking, actually, they're led by people who have a very strong moral compass and a very strong sense that this is what they want to be. They want to feel they're running an organization that is doing good in the world. So purpose generally can be quite well created. The problem is the company then doesn't live against those values. The company seems to believe that this purpose is some form of internal communications message. And if they get the words right and craft it right and then put it up on every wall and on every mouse map, then suddenly, if we still have mouse maps, then suddenly everyone in the organization will go, I feel really proud of this. And it's complete bollocks. That's not how human beings think or behave. So the key thing is, we see this again and again, where organizations work very hard on communication of purpose, and they measure, and we can measure, very high levels of awareness of purpose. And they think, well, this is fantastic. Everyone gets our purpose. 95% of our people can write down the purpose statement. And then you look at the actual output in terms of how people feel, and it's having zero impact, because the purpose doesn't mean anything to them. It doesn't live, because they're using purpose as a sort of noun, not a verb. They're not using it as a way of driving every decision in the organization. Purpose is a cultural phenomenon. It's like your area of risk and your favorite word, compliance. It's a cultural phenomenon. And organizations, because they can't kind of measure it, they sort of think that they have to sort of control and systemize it. And purpose is a little similar to that. It has to be the lived experience of people, because it's a set of beliefs. It's not a set of statements. And I think organizations, where they get this wrong, don't have the courage and the energy to actually change how they work. So if you think about any organization that fundamentally lives in it by its purpose and is effective in it, if you think about what they do, actually almost everything they do is driven by their purpose. And that is very different to an organization that says something and then doesn't change the way the leadership and the management and every level of the organization behaves. Now, if I'm an employee in that organization, at best, I feel disconnected and disengaged, and it doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not psychologically damaged by it, but I just kind of go, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And at worst, I feel ripped off. And actually, what is worse in our measurement is it's the people who are the most potentially emotionally engaged are the ones that feel the most disappointed. So there is some evidence that doing purpose badly is a lot worse than not doing it at all, because it undermines the relationship, the trust between you as an organization and the talent within the company. So I would say to companies, if you're going to do this, you've got to do it properly. You've got to really believe this, and it has to then drive how the organization exists. But it doesn't have to be radical. It just has to be, here's a statement of what we believe in, and this is how we're going to behave. So, Unilever makes sustainable living commonplace, or whatever their phrase is. I think that's what they say. It drives their decisions. It doesn't drive every decision, but where am I going to source my materials from? What packaging am I going to use? What communication am I going to give to my customers? What acquisition choices are we going to make? How are we going to manage our energy, our supply chain? What suppliers are we going to use? The list is endless. And every time they come up with a choice, they now have a consciousness about what the big why that sits behind that choice. And 9 times out of 10, they want to be making the choice based on that purpose, to say, well, actually, is it making sustainability commonplace? Is it allowing people to live sustainably? Is it allowing the planet to continue and to exist, and all those things? Now, that creates clarity. But the other thing it creates is an enormous level of pride in the people who work there, and arguably, for most, if not certainly not all, consumers, it makes consumers want to buy their product more. But the last part of that is the jury is somewhat out on that one.
And I love the little bit where you said not every single decision is going to be driven by it, because the sort of a purist answer to this piece would be to say, every single thing we do, we stick 100% rigidly to this. And I like the fact that you kind of picked that up, which is to sort of go, there are going to be situations where it's going to be really hard, or if not impossible, to do the thing. So we recognize we're deviating from it. And I think the interesting bit here is being honest about that and having that sort of discussion. So the decision isn't kind of, let's secretly override the rules. It's let's think purposefully around, pun intended, how we do that. And I think that is sort of at the nub of this issue you're talking about, which is sort of to say, actually, we need to be human around this. So people can smell bullshit, and they know when they're being told one thing and then they see the reality is different, and that feels awkward and uncomfortable for all of us. And we see that with politicians and a ton of other people out there. But what I thought was interesting was your depiction of it is sort of purpose is just what helps you navigate the world. And therefore, it's not something that you rigidly stick to. it becomes a guiding principle which sort of infuses how you look at the world and how you look at solving problems.
Yeah, well, this is where I'm impaled on this appalling dilemma because, and you're back to practicality against sort of morality. So to say what you've said gives people enormous latitude to take the piss and just ignore it. And that's the big risk, that people can say, oh, well, of course, it's just not practical that we will live with this principle in reality. We'll do the best we can. But that, at what point does that just become platitudes and CSR and a bit of puff? Organizations, the answer to this question is about genuine authenticity, that leaders have to be authentic. They have to believe this, and then they have to have the courage to exercise it. And it is not pain-free, and it is not cost-free, and nor should it be. It should be painful. So we as an organization, for example, are a B Corp. So being a B Corp is not pain-free, and it's not cost-free, and it's been very difficult. It's been hugely energetic. It is the best decision we ever made. But it requires you to be authentic. And I think all of these ideas of benefit corporations and purposeful companies are just coming back to this idea that organizations have a responsibility to the people within society at large and the planet. What I think is right to say is, assuming that you are an honorable person and that you believe in this sense of why you exist and you strive towards that, because ultimately you want to go home and look at your kids and go, we did the best we could. If that is all true, then it is also acceptable to say, but I acknowledge that in the real world, I can't just make these decisions all the time. We are under all sorts of pressures, from regulators, from fiduciary pressures, from pensions, from competitors, from the realities of business life. But the point is, you are authentically striving towards that goal. Then yes, you can be practical. The dilemma I face is that as soon as you start saying, well, of course, the reality of the world is, and you don't have to do this all the time, it's very easy for companies to start being dishonest. And something I've said before is that I genuinely think people don't mind. People don't object to companies making money. They object to companies being dishonest. And whether I'm an employee or a customer or an observer, I object dishonesty. I don't like seeing people pulling the wool over my eyes for their own personal gain. And so I think, yes, it is true to say that organizations are allowed to be practical. And I absolutely believe that organizations are allowed to make profit and return to shareholders, because that makes the world go round, and it is perfectly acceptable. The interesting thing actually is that profit and return tends to go up, at least on our numbers, if you get this right, but that's an aside. I think what is the point is about authenticity, that if you are authentic, then you have to be practical. And someone said, one of the FTSE 100 CEOs said, this is a 10-year project for us, because focusing not on profit, but on long-term return, that's a long-term project. It's not something that you're going to do immediately. So the answer again is both, really. But yes, there is no point in being purist about this.
It's interesting when you talk about, authenticity, because I think, as I was reflecting on, when does one see this? Well, it's when companies make mistakes, and how do they respond to that? And I think there's something fascinating, which is sort of the traditional logic was hush it up, keep it quiet, don't let anybody know, and we'll ride this one out. And actually what you see happening now is the companies that navigate these things well are the ones that put their hands up and go, we screwed up. They do it quickly, they do it effectively, they solve the problem that's been caused, and they do it, they're very public around how they've managed that particular situation. And I think it's fascinating to see. And as you were talking, I was thinking very much around the sort of historic dynamics. How would we find out what was going on? Well, in a more tightly knit community, word spreads. And then we lost that a little bit in terms of sort of, if you looked at the communications channels that were available, it was sort of all about managing the press in the old days and managing me. And now, of course, with social media and the ability everybody has to communicate, that level of transparency around not just what you do, but how you do it is changing fundamentally. And we've got an individual can cause you problems. So one member of staff in a store doing something unhelpful causes you problems for your whole brand. one customer interaction that goes south. And I think this is fascinating because it's precisely to your point now. It's not, you can't get away with stuff that you might have got away with in the past because people can see you're doing it. And so the question, it's not really, you don't really have a choice as to whether you choose this, because a lot of things that used to be invisible are now visible. And so I think when you talk all around this authenticity piece, it isn't a case of sort of going, well, we'll decide whether we're going to play in the authenticity space or not. You are being talked about. You are being observed. People are commenting on you, having views on you in a way that they may not have done in the past because a lot of this stuff was invisible. And so I think it's a very 21st century dynamic that you're talking about.
Yes. I mean, I think it's slightly more nuanced than that, in that companies can get away with it. And therefore, if it was the case that all companies were always observed and everything they did was transparent, then actually it would be a bit easier for companies because they would have no choice. Regressively, companies still believe they have a choice because they do observe companies that behave badly and get away with it. And they still observe consumers and customers who are prepared to buy product from companies that are destructive for reasons of convenience or self-gratification. And we all do that. We all buy products that we know are causing harm because we want them. So companies are allowed to cause harm, and people will work for companies that are fundamentally destructive if you pay them enough. And there has been some really interesting research in how much money you have to pay someone to work for a company that is destructive as opposed to one that has a social agenda. It's very interesting. It's quite a lot. I think it was about 40% pay increase. But ultimately, everyone has a price. So to be realistic about it, and also to really, I think, to highlight the real issue here, it is possible to get away with it. The problem is, when you don't get away with it, you are completely screwed. And because of the transparent nature of the world, because of how fast information flows, because of everything from Glassdoor to Twitter to the citizen journalist and all the rest of it, companies are under scrutiny like never before. So you have a balance of risk. If you decide not to exercise your moral compass, but just exercise your financial compass and go, how can I make the most money? Then you have a balance of risk. So again, we're back to a moral or practical argument. So morally speaking, you should just go, well, we'll just do the right thing. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And why is this difficult? But if you don't exercise that and you go, no, my responsibility is to maximize return, then you have a balance of risk. The interesting thing about the purpose or pro-social type of approach to business is that it actually addresses both sides of that problem, because what happens is the world is on your side if you demonstrate with courage that you believe in something. And there are a million examples of that, of organizations that make mistakes, disadvantage customers, hurt people, but do it because it's genuinely a mistake. And if they've got a foundation where people go, but they're on the right side of history, they're the good guys, people tend to be extraordinarily forgiving. And you can think of a lot of examples where companies have got this right and a lot of examples where companies have got this wrong. And it's sometimes surprising how much people are allowed to get away with, how much forgiveness they're given if the world is on your side. And the world is on your side if you're honest, you have integrity, and you've expressed some courage and you've stood for something. And people will say, they stand for something I believe in, I will commit. And that is whether the person is an employee or a commentator or a customer. So employees will go the extra mile. Because we talk a lot to purposeful companies and we do all this measurement, it's been very interesting in COVID looking at the reaction of employees and customers actually, but employees specifically, when companies have done some extraordinarily difficult things like reduced pay, sent people home, taken away a lot of what they would consider to be their rights, because they've had to, and how in purposeful companies people have gone, we understand that we have a shared mission here, a shared endeavor. I will take the pain and I'm proud to do it. And I think companies that stand for nothing, their employees are likely to say, why? Why should I do anything for you? You've never done anything for me. So there is this simplistic argument, but it's actually relatively true, that if you stand for something, people are on your side. And the same thing with customers and observers, and the crowd. The crowd look at companies in COVID who've done the right thing and judge them kindly. Now, that's not to say that they all rush out and immediately buy their product. As I say, their journey is, at least my jury, is somewhat out on this belief that customers are all driven by their sense of morality and not by their sense of personal interest. But it's a movement towards that. And certainly, where it doesn't cost me anything, I'm much more likely to be kind and judge kindly a company that has shown that it stands for something. And I think the whole COVID thing has been quite an interesting experiment, quite an interesting kind of microscope to put companies under, because it's brought out a lot of interesting behaviours, both internally and externally.
And I think that was going to be the sort of next piece to pick up, because I think you're right. It almost feels like the tide has gone out, and you can see what people are wearing underneath. And this is a time when actually, because this was relatively unpredictable. I mean, the interesting thing about COVID is, on the one hand, super predictable that a pandemic would strike, and there were government departments and scientists warning of this. And yet for most of us, this came out of nowhere. And for many businesses, pandemic wouldn't have been on their top 10, maybe not even top 20 or 30. At the end of 2019, you wouldn't have had that on your sort of top risk register. Certainly not in sort of Western countries. You might have done in Asia. And so suddenly there's been a real test of the dynamics that you were talking about. And you can't hide from this. That's the bit I find fascinating here. It's sort of, this isn't we're going to ride this one out, because you are having to make decisions that bring this into play.
Yeah, absolutely. And from our narrow interest, what's fascinated us about this is, if you believe in productive, effective organizations that really work, what happens when the organization atomizes? What happens to an organization when it's not an organization anymore? When we've built a world on certain cozy assumptions for most people, but not everyone, but for most people. You go to an office and you do that 5 days a week, and you are required to be there for a certain number of hours, and you require to have a limited amount of holiday and time off. And that's just the way it works. And it would be radical, and it is considered to be radical when companies do things like say work when you like. Reed Hastings at Netflix saying, we don't have a holiday policy, and people going, how the hell do you run a company if you give them as much holiday as they like? And he says, well, we don't have a clothing policy either, but people don't turn up naked. The sense that if you give people a sense of reason, of importance, people are basically intelligent, principled human beings who are programmed to join into a community. And if the community means something to them, they will commit to that community. And that commitment is what drives a lot of productivity and effectiveness in organizations, including things like risk and compliance. But back to COVID, what's interesting is where organizations have that sense of purpose. We were very interested to know, well, what would happen when they all go and work from home? And one of the things fortuitously that we have measured is whether you work from home or in the office. And we never really looked at it before, I've got to say, because it's never really been relevant. Because a tiny percentage of any employee base in any company we've measured works from home. And they're generally so small. And actually, they didn't on the face of it appear to be all that different. But there's a reason for that. So when we look at that data, and we measure people who have now been required to or have always worked from home, they appear massively sensitized to purpose in a way that we've never noticed before. So if you look at a group of human beings who work in an organization and they believe that the company stands for something beyond profit, they believe that that company stands for something that they can be proud of, which we'll call purpose, but it's just that sense that I believe absolutely that this organization stands for something, and I identify with that, and I'm proud of that. They are significantly more effective as employees. So they're more productive, if you like. They're happier. They're clearly, but they're also, they're even things like they're clear on strategy. They're much more loyal. They will commit to that. They believe the company is more compassionate. They trust the company. They're much more open to ideas. There's a whole range of things. So that's a significant increase. Great. Then you look at people who work from home. They are 3 times as sensitized to that. So instead of a sort of 20 or 30% uplift from an average employee to one who believes in the purpose, you get a kind of 60 to 90% uplift. And you go, well, why is that? I mean, that's just weird. Why should someone working from home suddenly be so dramatically changed in terms of why should there be such a difference between the average person and the ones who believe in the purpose just because I've been stuck at home? And I think what this is it comes back to Sadal Neely, who's a professor at Harvard. She's done a lot of interesting work on social distance. So in that world that I talked about earlier, where we go to work every day and all that stuff, there's a lot of irritations about that. But actually, there are 1,000 social connections a day that we never even think about. And suddenly, when you're working from home, there are none of those social connections. And it's very difficult to recreate them. And everyone knows who's kind of on Zoom pizza night stuff. They just basically don't really work because there's no real social connection. The big social connection appears from our numbers to be purpose. And although that might sound mystifying, I think actually all it's saying is because I, sitting in my bedroom, realize or accept or fundamentally believe that I am on a shared endeavor, that we have a shared sense of meaning, I then take some responsibility, because what happens is I feel ownership, emotional ownership of my organization. That keeps me productive, effective, and happy. And if I don't have that sense of purpose, I go into a tailspin. So the reason the big difference is there's a massive difference between people who don't feel the company to be purposeful. They lose social connection, they lose interest, they lose motivation, and they have potentially quite significant challenges because they don't know why they exist. They don't know why they're there. A big chunk of their world has been removed. People who believe the organization stands for something, who've been given the privilege of seeing their companies purposeful, are still committed, and committed is the word. And what committed means is with no hierarchy, no control, no supervision, no observation, I will still do my best work, deliver creativity, innovate, think about the good of the company, because it's my company. And that's the key thing. And I think what sits at the heart of a lot of our research is actually ultimately what purpose does is it makes the company mine. And that extends into all areas of human behavior in organizations. Now, if it's mine, then I'm going to do my best work for the company, but I'm also going to protect it. So another area of interest, you mentioned COVID, another real area of interest is sort of things like risk management and compliance and all those kind of things. Purpose has a big role there because people feel it's mine. You know, I am proud of this. I can own this sense of purposefulness. Therefore, I'm not going to do the company any harm. I'm going to look out for the good of the organization. I'm going to be creative and innovative. I'm going to, if you like, obey the rules, not because the rules are there, but because I understand the purpose the company serves. So I am going to be a civic beneficiary in the organization rather than a detractor. And I think that's why this conversation is so interesting around purpose. And I think you're right to say that COVID has kind of brought it all to the fore. And I like your analogy of the tide going out, and you can see no one's wearing any swimming trunks. You know, the tide goes out, and the people who are standing and feeling still connected, even though they're not swimming anymore, if we can really make this analogy difficult, yeah, they're the guys who kind of go, yeah, I know why we exist. It's my business. You know, I care about this because we stand for something. And it doesn't matter whether I'm working from home or working in the office. I give a shit because this matters. And I think so many big companies just spent the last 30 years forgetting that and haven't given people the privilege of being able to feel ownership, feel connection, feel that it matters because it's theirs. And actually, entrepreneurial small companies are quite good at that because they kind of go, well, you know, it is yours because we're all in it together and you know the founder and all those things. But all of that can be replicated. And I get into debates with people who go, well, you just give them some shares, you know, and then they literally feel ownership. And I just don't believe it. I look at the numbers we see. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether you own 50 shares in a 5 billion valuation business. It makes no difference. It's an emotional conversation about how you feel connected in the same way you would feel connected to any other community, you know, a sports team or the local community or whatever. People seek connection and meaning It's like Dan Pink stuff. Why do people go and learn an instrument? Why do people learn to paint? Why do people dig an allotment or volunteer their time? Because it makes them feel connected. And organizations are so thick not to use that to their benefit, to actually spend the time to get to understand or allow people to understand why they exist. And if they don't know why they exist, which is fundamentally part of the problem, then they're never going to be an effective organization. And all of the stuff we've talked about, from COVID to transparency to social media, is just exposing the reality, exposing the bare bones of these organizations. And the clever ones are saying we need to stand for something, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, although that's pretty important, but because it galvanizes people, it brings people together, it allows people to feel a sense of pride, and as I say, most importantly, ownership.
I mean, so many things I want to pick up there. I mean, the first obvious one being the share ownership, I think is really interesting, because I think that is a very legalistic approach. Legally, you now own the company. So, you don't. You own a tiny little slither of it, where your personal contribution is probably not going to make that much difference in the scheme of things. So I think it's a sort of simple solution to things. Let's make everybody shareholder. And you're right. That doesn't work on a human level. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on the sort of the two bits of my work. So I look at human risk as the obvious headline bit, but the flip side of that is human reward, which is getting the best out of your people. And I look at both of those levels of intervention. Of course, they're interrelated. So if the way you control people to try and mitigate the human risk can constrain the human reward. Ditto, if you open up human reward and go, just make us tons of money, whatever it takes, you'll cause yourself problems on the human risk end of the spectrum. So, but at both ends of the spectrum, the thing you're talking about there works, because if you have a purpose anchoring your sort of on the positive side, the things that you do, the conscious actions, how you run the business, then that is going to make sure that you are doing it in the right way. So that's going to drive you forward to get the best possible outcomes in your specific role. Equally, it's going to help you on the human risk side, because it gives you a sense of direction and a sense of, well, what should I really be doing this? And how do I think about solving this problem? And thinking outside the strict confines. So I like the fact that when you talk about that, it gives you an anchor at both ends of the spectrum, which is the positive business, generating the profits and making the money, but also on the flip side of controlling it. And I think that's a really interesting thing that's missed, because when people think about human capital, it's kind of been approached in many respects in a very logical way. Let's just reward that capital in the right way, set some strict rules, and we'll be fine. And I think what you've highlighted there with all the examples that you've given is sort of, we're living in a very changing world. And so you need to have flexible structures in order to make sure that you can survive. And those flexible structures come by bringing people in to do things that require them to be flexible and agile and shift around. And so I love the way that you're talking about it, because I think that's almost the solution to how do we manage these human risk and human reward challenges in the 21st century. The answer is we need to get to people on a human level and really connect with them. And so, as you rightly pointed out, purpose is the way to achieve that.
Yeah, I think so. In a purist sense, if we go back to our old, the pure moral argument against the practical one, you'd say, well, you don't need compliance officers, and the whole lot, should be immediately made redundant. I'd love to be a compliance officer, because I think there's a real opportunity for them to reframe the role to be, inspirational officers. Kind of, as you say, the flip side of compliance is how do you motivate, how do you inspire people, and the in a purist sense, no one is going to be uncompliant if they are reasonably intelligent and care about the organization. Now, the reality, going back to the other side of our little dichotomy we keep coming back to, is you do need to have some kind of observation and control. I think it's just got a bit out of kilter. But I think if people really care about the organization, a lot of the issues go away. And being giving them a reason to care is what we're talking about, because human beings are not sort of assets in the way they're sort of considered. They're not sort of resources. It's Dan Pink's thing about companies seem to think their people are slightly sweeter smelling horses, that carrot and stick, and everyone's going to do what they're told. And that's not how people work. But the difference between a horse and a human being is a human being is a meaning-driven machine. So if you give them enough meaning, 95% perhaps of people, you've got to accept there are the odd psychopath and sociopath and all that, but generally speaking, the vast majority of your people will do the best they can for you, because they believe in what you've said because it's authentic. Back to authenticity. If it's not authentic, all the bets are off on this. But if you're authentic, a lot of those issues are resolved. And yes, organizations are very complicated. What's interesting to me is if you write down on a piece of paper, why, what, and how, and if you read Simon Sinek, he does it in a different direction because Simon, you're wrong. Why, what, and how. And I think what happens in organizations is we get a lot of stuff happens in how. How are we going to do this? What? And then some stuff happens in what, which is all the stuff about what's the strategy. What do we need to do? So if you're presented with a problem, it's like, well, what can we do about this? And then how are we going to resolve the problem? Where the clarity sits is in why. And so often in conversations, if you just think, but why? Why are we doing this? What's really fundamentally important? That's where clarity and connections sit. So if you think of that kind of in layers of context, large organizations, in my experience of them, spend a hell of a lot of time getting confused and having debates and conversations in what and how. If you go to a strategy session in a large organization, they won't usually start with, well, why are we doing this? They'll start with, what are we going to do? Well, that's difficult. And then they pass that down to the next level of management who are all about, well, how do we implement this? The conversation, which is really difficult but very clarifying, is why, always. Whether it's a relationship between two people or an organization, it's what is the purpose that sits behind this? So the reason purpose is clarifying is because it elevates that conversation to why is this important? We've got an argument, but what is it we fundamentally agree with? What's really driving this? We're both passionate about this because actually we believe in the same thing. We just never discussed that. If we discussed what we fundamentally believed in, then the argument can be resolved, or we can make a choice. So I always think if you're stuck, go up. By which I think go from how to what to why, and why is about at its most at the top end of why, if you like, is what is the purpose the organization serves. And then you can say, well, what is the purpose of this project? What is the purpose of this department? What's important? And if you don't like the word purpose, then just go, why are we here? What are we trying to achieve here? What is it fundamentally we're trying to do? And actually, if you go up layers of purpose, ultimately you get to love, because ultimately what we're here to do is to love and support and protect each other and protect society. And that's a conversation that most organizations would not want to go and have. A conversation about fundamentally, do we love each other? But that's the topic for a different podcast. But I do think there is this sense that we get stuck because we don't see the clarity that sits in why. And if you want to call why purpose, that's fine, because it's a word that we kind of understand. So you started this conversation is what's purpose? Purpose is the fundamental reason we deserve to exist as an organization. Okay, so once you've clarified and articulated that, we're here to care, to protect, whatever it is, the words we've used, then is this decision we're making, whether that's as an individual or as a group, reflective of that? Does that clarify it? So risk and compliance. Is the choice I'm about to make reflective of the purpose the organization serves? And you'll find that mostly people, if A, the purpose is right, and B, this sort of compliance, or whatever the language is rational and logical, people will look at the purpose and internalize it and act unconsciously with purpose in mind, and they won't do damage because they wouldn't want to, and it's clear for them. Now, where things go wrong is some of the stuff you talked about earlier, where the purpose is confused, or it's not credible, or it's not authentic, or it's not congruent to what the company actually does. And in most cases, what we observe is purpose is often a matter of confusion. And the other big topic we've not really talked about is trust. That none of this works unless the organization has spent a lot of time creating a culture of trust. But my point, I think, is that if there is confusion, then why tends to resolve that confusion.
And I think that's really interesting stuff, because you were talking about, you said, well, there's a few people, there's a few psychopaths and sociopaths in the organization, and I sort of go, I think, that chimes neatly with your point, because if you focus on those people, you say, okay, we're going to set out to control, what's the worst that could happen here? Well, we've had, banking, we have rogue traders, right? So we're going to stop those people. We're going to focus on that. We're going to focus. We never want that to happen. And you sort of look at it and say, if you've got somebody that is just going down that path and is blindly going to go down that path, and maybe they do sit in the sort of psychopath end of the spectrum, then actually your rules and your controls aren't going to stop those people, right? Because they have detached themselves from exactly all of these human dynamics that you're talking about, right? That's how they operate. They switch off from those things. They don't care what other people think. They don't. So they've switched. They've disconnected from that particular piece. So when you look at purpose and sort of say, well, the reason I think purpose is so valuable and strong, and trust and all of these human dynamics, is because actually the vast majority of people who aren't the incredibly saintly or incredibly sinner end of the spectrum are influenceable and will shift and will change and will respond to the environment that they're in. And so what it's about doing, I think, is building an environment where you use these human dynamics that we all intuitively understand in a corporate setting to get the most out of people. And the bit I find fascinating is when you dissect it the way you have, what we're doing here is we're going, so what is at the heart, what drives us as human beings in our interactions and how we think about the world? And then for some reason, when we put people in a corporate structure, that is sometimes forgotten. And it's sort of, we will now approach things ignoring all of those factors, and we'll approach things logically. And of course, that's not how we think. And there isn't a distinction between a human being that exists outside an employment and the human being that walks in. Now, you might behave slightly differently. It's a question of professionalism and certain things you can do in your private sphere that you wouldn't do in the office. But nonetheless, it's that basic humanity. And I think what you've been bringing out there is it's really about saying, okay, if you're going to employ people, which every company on some level has to do, no matter how automated they are, then you need to work out how to get the most out of them. And that involves pulling these basic human dynamics that in any other context we understand. We understand that in the family, we understand with our friends, when we interact in our personal lives. And I find it fascinating when you put it in those simple terms, is that's all we're doing. That's all we're talking about here, really, is to say, let's take those things that we know operate in the out of work sphere and try and bring those out of people in the work sphere. If we can do that, then we can be successful because we're being more human.
Absolutely right. Spot on. So in economics, there's a whole conversation about the rational actor. We will do everything for our self-interest. And I think that's kind of true, but only where we haven't been given another reason. So when I was a brand manager, I was always told that if you don't give anyone a reason to buy your product, they'll buy it on price. And so branding is all about creating value beyond price. Otherwise, you're just competing on price. And in the same way, I think in organizations, if you don't give people a reason, if you don't respect people enough to actually give them a reason to be there, then they will be as rational as they can be. And so they will revert to self-interest or laziness, or they just don't care. And why should they? So when we look at organizations and we measure purpose, performance, and organizational effectiveness, actually what we observe is not lots of negative people who hate it and are miserable. We observe maybe 10%, at worst 20%. What we observe is an enormous number of people who sort of don't get it because no one's ever really taken the trouble to articulate it in a way that's meaningful. Or if they have, they don't fundamentally believe it because they don't see that's how the company actually behaves. So you end up with organizations full of people who are sort of, kind of near. I think of it as sort of beige middle, that the organization is full of people who would love to believe. And when we measure people, not about 90% of people in most organizations would love to believe their company stands for something. And if they could just believe that, and believing that requires really only three things. One, the company needs to be very clear about what it believes, the things we've talked about, and that it has to be congruent with what the company does. It has to be clearly communicated. But more importantly than anything, it then has to drive all its decisions. So that clarity, yes, this is what we believe in, and you will see this every day. Now that's, as we said earlier, not to say that every decision is always slavishly, but it is the awareness of that purpose informs the decision making. It is discussed constantly. People are rewarded at least emotionally for abiding by it. So there is that clarity. The second thing is trust. People must feel safe. And most people in most organizations, I would contend, fundamentally do not feel safe anymore. That they feel that they are likely to be blamed or humiliated, or there's just a risk. And I think in large organizations, we've got so used to that, we don't think it's strange. If you lived at home as you live at work, for most people, it wouldn't be very comfortable. If you thought you were constantly going to be blamed for stuff and held accountable, and you might be sacked at any moment, some random redundancy program, all this stuff. Perhaps I'm being unnecessarily negative, and perhaps people will howl and go, that's not what my company's like. But no, really think about it. Now, I know lots of people who leave large organizations and go work for small organizations or charities, or just retire and go, God, I spent 30 years and I've not realized that actually I wasn't terribly happy. So trust is absolutely key. And trust to me is about, because you're absolutely consistent in how you treat people, because you're fundamentally compassionate and really believe and treat people with respect and dignity and care about them, and you protect them and you are honest with them, they feel that they can trust. And some of these companies that have high levels of trust are very hard places to work. I mean, my God, they expect you to work hard, but it's a contract. I've committed to you and you've committed to me. So I think that's fine. It's not about making places all lovely, and it's nothing about beanbags and coffee machines. It's about a fundamental human belief in creating an environment where people feel completely safe and trust the organization and the intention behind it. So we have an intention, a purpose. We have real clarity about how it's communicated and how it's exercised, and we have a culture of trust. Then for 90% of people, they will take ownership of that, and it will drive their decisions, and they will become more committed, and they'll become more productive, and they'll stay in the company longer, and they will do all the things, and customers will realize and recognize what amazing people these are. These guys all seem to believe it, and they've all drunk the same Kool-Aid, and it's a great place to buy stuff from, and suppliers will be proud to supply to you. So, but it requires those three things to be, which is what I would call clarity of context. In other words, purpose drives everything. Secondly, trust, which is very hard, and it requires work, actually. It really requires organizations to think about how they treat their people all the time, and probably quite a lot of new coaching for the senior leadership about openness, transparency, all those things. And then ownership. And if people fundamentally don't own, then they don't care. And the output of people not caring, not owning, not feeling it's theirs, is all the stuff that we've talked about and that you talk about on other ones of your podcast, which is risk and compliance and ultimately things like fraud and dealer and trading fraud and all that stuff. And that the fact that can exist is a function that the majority of people don't own the company. Because when I've spoken occasionally, just once or twice, to banking organizations where fraud has been conducted, and you talk to the people who are kind of close to the trader or whoever, they often say, well, yeah, I knew what they're up to, but it's none of my business. And you kind of go, what you're saying is it's not my business. What you're saying is I don't own this. What you're saying is this is not mine. Because
it's literally not my business, right? Yeah.
How often do you hear people say, oh, it's none of my business? What they're saying is it's not my business. It's not mine. So one of the things I've heard you talk to other contributors about is the fact that you're required to leave your humanity and your real personality at the door. And I think that is a real problem. And companies, that to me is at the heart of trust. So I think all this sounds enormously and overwhelmingly complicated. And I really think our observation is that it isn't. And our observation is that it can, we can show, we have the numbers that show how this works. We've done it in loads of companies. We know how this thing works. It is really simple. It is about understanding why you exist and exercising that with authenticity and courage. It's about creating cultures of openness and transparency and trust. And it's about allowing your people to feel a sense of ownership of that. That's all it is. Now, that's not to say it's easy, and it's not to say that it's not radical, but it is not complicated. It just requires a lot of effort. And the output is remarkable. We see companies that just perform so much better, and people are happier, and the mental health is great. And people, and ultimately, if you're a leader, you end up running an organization you're proud of, not an organization that is exciting or stressful or challenging, but one actually that fundamentally makes your heart sing. That's the real goal. And the output of all this is a society that is benefited from having these organizations within it, and a planet that's sustainable. Because any organization, I think, looking at its purpose has to have within that a concept, an understanding of how it's solving the big fundamental issues in the world, both the social issues, Black Lives Matter and human dignity, and slavery and all those things, but also the fundamental systemic issue, which is climate change. Because if we're not resolving the climate emergency, then all of this is theoretical. So I think, if you look for both the moral and the practical, the answer to that is you've got to sort out the climate emergency, and we all have to contribute. Because from a moral argument, it's indisputable. From a practical argument, we're all fried.
Right. So I think that's a sobering, but also uplifting, because I think, often we think this is too difficult to resolve. And part of the reason I think people don't shift to the way you're talking about it feels a bit difficult. And so it's nice to have, I think, a positive message combined with a serious one to close out on. Thank you so much, John. That has been, time has flown and it's been absolutely fascinating. If people want to get hold of you, how can they find you?
Oh, well, kind. Well, inevitably, I'm on LinkedIn, and there is only one. Well, actually, I'm John Rosling on LinkedIn. That'll find me. The company is Contexis, Contexis, and the measurement system. And I haven't, to my shame, given a name check to Cambridge University, because we've worked on this with Cambridge, and they are obviously brilliant. And so Cambridge and has been instrumental in creating this thing, and it's called the Contexis Index. So contextisindex.com will get you to the website to find all about measurement. And there's a lot of materials and information and films and all sorts of stuff on that. So my view is that, I'm really happy to talk to anyone about this stuff. I think it's a really interesting conversation about how you make organizations brilliant and how you help them make organizations that are wonderful for people within it. All the Contexis Index, and our work with Cambridge is about, is measuring it and providing some numbers so that you have a roadmap and a way of steering it. But the insights, the stuff from other companies is interesting. So it's all there, and it's freely available. I'm happy to talk to anyone about it.
Fabulous stuff. Listen, thank you so much. One, I think you do some great work, and the way you articulate it is very clear and I think thought provoking. So thank you for that. But thank you also for being such a great guest on the podcast.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to John for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about John's work at Contexis, visit the show notes. There's a link there to their website and other resources. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and haven't yet left a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk and some of the ways that you can mitigate human risk in your organization, the Human Risk newsletter and video channels, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, good luck finding your purpose, and thanks for listening.